everyone keeps shitting themselves over baseline gender politics. Nobody aware enough of autonomic intelligence feedback loops controlling the market, and the market moving to a content marketing method, which means the market is mainly selling narratives, which means autonomic intelligence feedback loops are selling narratives, which means literal fucking abstract mathematic algorithms are in charge of the proliferation of culture, since religion is fading out and there's no longer a common culture narrative. So fanatics turn to neo-corporate ideology, and the marketers don't realize they're playing with fire, and sooner than later, a crowd of disgruntled fanatics are going to come close to, if not outright, kill someone like the Frenchies back in '08. Things are so much worse than you could possibly imagine. In English, Einstein? Okay, so back in the day, some computer nerds made machines that would take a bunch of outside data, process it, and try to predict the future. To fund it, they predominantly sold the information to people who wanted to buy and sell stocks. Enough people started doing this that they started making the machines send out stock reports themselves, which other machines took in as data to further sell, buy, and report on stock themselves. This eventually created a massive feedback loop of stock data being managed by autonomic intelligence, not the same as artificial intelligence. It outright blocked out the human element, and right now, the open secret is that the market is out of human control. If anyone tried to remove these data loops, even one out-of-sync chain link could cause the world economy to collapse overnight. You following me so far? So basically, in tandem with this technology, the internet happened and a load of marketers started moving to content marketing, which is the idea that the product and the marketing are the same thing, and that you're selling a lifestyle story, which is why if you pay attention, most companies that used to just sell a product have made massive investments into media space. This is fine in and of itself. The 80s had a similar version of this. The problem is that the easy proliferation of consumer data reaches these autonomic intelligences, and they begin to report on what kind of narratives sell versus which ones don't. Simple, right? Well, not really. You see, we live in a post-hypernormalization world, a Soviet term for propaganda that keeps things as something when the reality is different. When you mix in marketing and propaganda with feedback loops, and add on top of that Google's ad program that essentially bubbles people into feedback loops and only give them what they want to hear so they can sell something, it basically creates mass psychological dissonance between different groups of people that, consciously or not, have their life's context formed around media narratives. It's one reason why the social justice stuff is hitting so hard now, despite the fact that America is an otherwise pretty prosperous country with no major problems causing anyone to starve. Anyway, the implication is that you basically have cultural narrative context being created by literal abstract machines who may or may not be intelligent. That's no good, because there's no moral perimeter to stop the data from trying to get everyone to kill each other. See, people keep thinking the robot revolution's gonna be Terminator, but it's gonna be more like The Shining. So people have their lives contextualized by inhuman machinations, which, okay, it's pretty bleak, but not outright destructive, right? Just a bunch of consumers being taken for a ride, right? Well, no. You see, the consequence of religion more or less falling out of style in the public consciousness is that there's no longer a single common cultural narrative. So you just don't get to see Tim at Sunday school, so what? Well, the larger point of contention is that there's always been a considerable percentage of any population that gives way to fanatic behavior, which in antiquity usually meant religious fanaticism. But if the narrative of religion is weakened, and the only other alternatives to narrative are autonomically generated content marketing narratives, too shallow to really make a lifestyle out of, you run into a phenomenon where a percentage of the population essentially migrated between brands in a pseudo-idolatrous methodology. When you really come down to it, a fan base is literally just the same thing as a cult. They both act as a community that bring people together to discuss a specific narrative. Except the religious ones, actually, at least, try to offer the illusion of being beneficial to society at large, while the autonomic models are there purely for profit and offer hedonic sensory overload to compensate for any shallowness. Did you ever stop to think about how we live in a world where a bunch of people do crazy shit over cartoons, harass people and send death threats, and sell cars for sauce? Do you really think that's just normal behavior? No. Those sorts of people would have been in a fucking monastery a couple of 100 years ago. They're fanatics, pure and simple. Nothing wrong with being a fanatic if it's constructive, but these narratives don't have that interest in mind. So, to put it bluntly, we quite literally live in a society where abstract mathematical formulas are in charge of a market that pretty much doesn't sell products anymore, and is more focused on selling narrative scams based on the parameters from these algorithms. And a bunch of wackos who in another lifetime would have been witch burners, who have nothing to spiritually satisfy their intrinsic obsessive tendencies, are replacing a common cultural narrative with many different smaller ones in different tribes, which is how you end up with Nazis and commies in a prosperous capitalist country thinking the end of the world is next week, literally creating their own problems. One could argue that we have too much freedom of choice when it comes to information about narratives, and it's actively harming the society. The Russians use avant-garde techniques in their propaganda to give their population so much bizarre data to sift through. They just conform with no real goal in mind. The Chinese just censor and have less overall data fed to their population. But Americans simultaneously have too much data and too little diversity in the data, making it easy for context to corral them into a specific mindset. And all it takes is a pair of eyes to see that the current mindset for American populations is apathetic versus messiah complex murderousness. The silver lining is, I think these marketers don't know they're playing with fire. I don't think it's entirely out of the question that someday, soon a crowd of angry people will actually lynch content creators for not towing to their own narrative complex. And very soon, they may begin to live in fear. People think this sexual harassment stuff is a big happening, but I think it's only going to be a drop in a larger bucket that'll be the 2020s. If not apocalyptic, they will be interesting times.